On the warm night of 25th of June 1906, on the roof garden of Madison Square Garden, New York, Evelyn Nesbit pauses at the edge of the crowd. The orchestra is striking up the finale of Mamselle Champagne. Electric bulbs shimmer against the dark sky above the building her former lover designed. She smooths the fingers of her white kid gloves, a tiny motion drilled into every well-dressed woman of the Edwardian era, when gloves are as obligatory as shoes in public. Around her, society leans back in wicker chairs, laughing at the song, "I Could Love a Million Girls." She knows many of them have already seen her elsewhere, on postcard racks, magazine covers, studio portraits labeled simply "a bud." The next morning, the New York Times will describe the architect's death as a shocking rooftop murder before hundreds of witnesses and call it part of a crime of the century. But in this second before the gun is drawn, the story is quieter. A young woman in a borrowed world of privilege, straightening her gloves as if manners could still hold everything in place. The shot that follows will echo far beyond the garden. The cost will be written instead on her face. On Christmas Day, 1884, in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, a small industrial town along the Allegheny River, Florence Evelyn Nesbit is born into a family that considers itself secure in middle-class respectability. Her father, Winfield Scott Nesbit, works as a lawyer, and the household maintains the appearance of comfort, proper furniture, a piano in the parlor, the kind of domestic order that allows a family to believe in its own permanence. But when Evelyn is approximately 8 years old, her father dies suddenly, and the illusion of security collapses with him. Her mother, Elizabeth Lizzie Nesbit, a skilled seamstress, attempts to maintain their position by taking in sewing work, but debts accumulate faster than income. They move to Pittsburgh, then from one boarding house to another, each slightly shabbier than the last, always one step ahead of landlords demanding overdue rent. The child who will one day grace magazine covers across America spends these winters carrying bundles of fabric through cold streets, her hands chapped and her boots worn thin, the unglamorous reality of genteel poverty in the 1890s. An early portrait, a miniature painted by Philadelphia artist Mrs. Dara, when Evelyn was still quite young, captures the delicate features and large eyes that will later become her fortune. Subsequent photographic studies by Phillips of Philadelphia begin to circulate in limited art circles, recording what observers will describe as a face perfectly formed, but they also document something else. A working child whose extraordinary beauty quickly becomes her family's only marketable asset, the single resource that might lift them back toward respectability, or at least toward survival. In their succession of cold-rented rooms, her mother teaches a curriculum very different from what wealthy girls learn in finishing schools. The lessons are practical and urgent, never show need to outsiders, no matter how desperate circumstances become. Always say thank you with a smile that reveals nothing. Always appear composed, even when the rent is overdue and dinner uncertain. These are survival skills disguised as manners, the etiquette of precarity. The lesson Evelyn absorbs, though no one states it explicitly, is clear and brutal. Their survival now depends not on her father's profession or her mother's skill with a needle, but on how gracefully a pretty girl can be looked at, how effectively beauty can be converted into income. The narrator observes that before New York society ever hears the name Evelyn Nesbit, before she becomes the girl in the red velvet swing, or a tabloid sensation, her education in performance begins not in a drawing room or a dance master's studio, but in poverty, in the small, invisible adjustments required to appear respectable when you are anything but, to seem like you belong to a world that has already expelled you. In December 1900, barely 15 years old, Evelyn arrived in New York City with her mother, their trunks holding more hope than clothing. The city offers possibilities that Pittsburgh cannot. Theatrical work, artist studios, the chance that beauty might translate into security. Within days of their arrival, she is hired by painter James Carroll Beckwith to pose at his studio on West 57th Street. He describes her in letters to fellow artists as a perfectly formed nymph, and the word spreads quickly through New York's interconnected world of painters, photographers, and magazine editors. By early 1901, she was in constant demand as an artist's model. Photographers including Gertrude Casebier, one of the era's most prominent female photographers, and the Cerrone Studio, both Napoleon and his brother Otto, produce images that circulate in Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, Ladies' Home Journal, and on the popular picture postcards that Americans collect and send by the millions. One portrait, later titled Portrait Miss N, and now held by the National Gallery of Canada, shows her in a simple white dress, dark hair loose and flowing, gaze level and direct, the studied poise of a girl who has already learned to hold still under extended scrutiny, to become whatever the artist requires while revealing nothing of herself. The etiquette manuals stacked in bookshop windows insist that respectable women never appear gloveless in public spaces. Gloves are as essential as corsets and hats to feminine propriety. But in the studios where Evelyn works, she removes her gloves to reveal the fine bones and tapering fingers that artists particularly love to sketch and photograph. The removal becomes part of the performance, hands that suggest refinement but are available for artistic study, beauty that appears both accessible and untouchable. The press begins calling her the Little Sphinx, a nickname that appears in gossip columns and theater notices. Journalists are fascinated by her face's quality of withholding. She's extraordinarily photogenic, but somehow unrevealing, beautiful but enigmatic, perfectly composed in every image, yet impossible to read. What they interpret as mystery is actually discipline, the ability to sit motionless for hours, to hold an expression without fidgeting, to be looked at without returning the gaze with anything that might disturb the viewer's fantasy. The narrator reflects that seen from a distance, from the perspective of observers who encounter her image in magazines or on postcards, this appears to be an opportunity, a poor girl using her beauty to escape poverty, finding success through art and theater. Seen from the sitter's chair, from Evelyn's actual position during these long sessions, it is something else, a discipline of disappearance, the art of becoming an image while the girl inhabiting that image learns to absent herself from her own body. Her next appointment is not in a studio at all, but in an architect's private rooms, a different kind of stage entirely. By mid-1901, while appearing as a Spanish maiden in the chorus line of the enormously popular musical Florodora at the Casino Theater on Broadway, Evelyn is introduced to Stanford White, the celebrated architect whose firm McKim, Mead & White has designed many of New York's most prominent buildings. The Washington Square Arch, the original Madison Square Garden with its famous rooftop theater, mansions for Vanderbilts and Astors. White is 57 years old, a portly man with a reddish mustache, married, and known throughout the city as both an artistic genius and a generous patron of young performers. One afternoon, she and fellow chorus girl Edna Goodrich accept White's invitation to lunch at his private apartment on West 24th Street, a multi-story space discreetly entered through a door beside the back entrance to F.O. Schwartz toy store. In her memoirs, written decades later, both The Story of My Life and Prodigal Days, Evelyn describes the rooms with careful detail, concealed lamps creating theatrical lighting, Persian fabrics draped across divans, carved wooden panels and artworks collected from European travels. 2 flights up, she finds what will become infamous, a green-painted room featuring a red velvet swing suspended from the ceiling, the kind of whimsical luxury that the very wealthy install for their own amusement. What happens in these rooms that afternoon is described in Evelyn's later accounts with a mixture of clarity and ellipsis. She writes of being offered wine, of drinking more than she intended, of losing consciousness, and of waking to find that White had, as she carefully phrases it, taken advantage of her while she was insensible. In the language available to a woman writing about such events decades later, she indicates that he considered her virginity a problem that he had solved for her, a framing that transforms assault into a kind of favor. Society columns will never print the word rape in connection with their relationship. The word is unprintable in respectable journalism, and the concept itself is legally complex when the victim is a chorus girl rather than a lady. But what begins that afternoon is not a romance or even a consensual affair. It is an arrangement in which a powerful man claims access to a girl whose poverty and youth leave her with few mechanisms for refusal. The narrator observes that in an era that celebrates male artistic genius and female grace, in a city where architects are treated like royalty and chorus girls are assumed to be sexually available, White's private apartment functions as a stage set where a girl becomes part of the scenery. The velvet swing, the theatrical lighting, the concealed entrance, all are props in an architecture designed not for shelter, but for control, for transforming a working girl into decor. While White's mansions rise along Fifth Avenue, celebrated in architectural journals and society pages, another kind of architecture is being constructed in these hidden rooms, an architecture of silence built from a 16-year-old girl's understanding that survival sometimes requires swallowing what cannot be spoken. By 1902, Stanford White had assumed a role in Evelyn's life that blurs boundaries between patron, lover, and something closer to owner. He arranges for her to attend a private school to improve her education, pays tuition for her younger brother Howard to attend a military academy, and moves Evelyn and her mother into more comfortable lodgings, gestures that appear paternal to outside observers and that allow Lizzie Nesbit to believe, or pretend to believe, that White's interest in her daughter is avuncular rather than predatory. White takes Evelyn to expensive restaurants, Delmonico's on Fifth Avenue and 44th Street, Sherry's further uptown, establishments where New York's elite gather for elaborate multi-course dinners. At these tables, while White orders oysters and terrapin and champagne, Evelyn studies the choreography of formal dining as performed by the women at surrounding tables. She observes which fork to use for which course, how to hold a wine glass, how to signal servants without speaking, the hundreds of small gestures that distinguish those who belong from those who are merely visiting. She watches society women arrive and depart, never bareheaded, never without gloves, their accessories functioning as a kind of armor that announces their status and protects them from unwanted attention. White also brings her to the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, the building he designed with its distinctive tower topped by Augustus St. Gaudens's sculpture of Diana. From private boxes, she watches performances while observing the audience, learning to distinguish between old money and new, between genuine aristocrats and those merely playing the part. The education White provides is practical and expensive. He is teaching her to pass, to move through spaces where chorus girls are normally admitted only as entertainments, never as guests. His checks pay for this curriculum, arriving regularly to cover rent and school fees and clothing, but the unspoken understanding, clear to Evelyn, if not officially acknowledged, is that generosity creates obligation, that patronage is a form of ownership. She learns that gratitude is always expected, that silence about the nature of their relationship is required, that accepting support means accepting his continued access to her body and his control over increasing areas of her life. In her memoirs, written after his death and after everything that follows, she will remember both the thrill of these rooms, the luxury, the sense of possibility, of doors opening that had been closed to a Pittsburgh seamstress's daughter, and also that these rooms were always, fundamentally, his. She was being allowed to visit spaces she could never own, being taught manners she could never fully claim as natural to her, being displayed as evidence of White's taste and generosity, rather than valued for herself. The narrator reflects that while newspaper readers follow White's latest Beaux-Arts commissions, the Pennsylvania station designs, the mansions for Gilded Age families, he is also engaged in a private architectural project, redesigning a young woman's understanding of home, of safety, of what she might owe in exchange for survival. On a humid evening in July 1901, audiences at the Casino Theater applaud the chorus of Florodora, the musical whose Florodora girls have already achieved a certain notoriety for marrying millionaires. Several members of the original chorus have left the show to wed wealthy stage door admirers, a pattern that magazines discuss with a mixture of titillation and disapproval. Somewhere in the back line of dancers, executing the choreographed steps in perfect synchronization with the other girls. Evelyn counts beats and watches her marks on the stage floor, careful never to miss her position. Theater bills posted outside the casino list her name among the chorus. The lobby also sells picture postcards featuring her portrait in soft focus, hands folded demurely in her lap, available for 15 cents. These postcards circulate through the postal system, collected by admirers who have never attended a performance, her image reaching far beyond the theater into American homes, her face becoming familiar to strangers. Backstage between performances, older chorus girls share their accumulated knowledge of survival and advancement. The informal rules they teach are practical and specific. Never be seen in public without gloves, which signal respectability. Do not drink too much at after-theater supper parties, where wealthy men assess potential companions. Always write a gracious thank you note after every invitation, maintaining the fiction that you are a lady rather than a working performer. The stage manager measures hemlines to ensure they remain within legal bounds. The audience measures shoulders, ankles, the curve of necks, evaluating merchandise. A newspaper profile published in one of the theatrical weeklies, half gossip column and half advertisement, describes Evelyn as one of the most photographed faces in New York, a status that brings both opportunity and a particular kind of exposure. Magazine editors want her image, photographers request sessions, strangers recognize her on the street. What might appear as fame is actually a kind of currency. Her face has value that can be traded for access, for security, for the possibility of escaping the chorus line into something more stable. The narrator observes that on paper, in the official records of her employment and her bank account, Evelyn remains poor, her chorus salary barely sufficient to support herself and contribute to her mother's expenses. But in the social economy of Edwardian New York, she is already being consumed as if she were one of society's own ornamental daughters, her image circulating in the same magazines that feature debutantes and heiresses, her beauty treated as a public resource available for admiration and collection. Among the men who watch from the theater stalls, paying particular attention to her performances, is Harry Kendall Thaw, heir to a Pittsburgh railroad and coal fortune, a man whose family name represents exactly the kind of wealth that chorus girls dream of accessing through marriage. He sees not an actress perfecting her craft or a working woman supporting her family, but a damsel requiring rescue from the corrupting influence of Stanford White, a cause around which he will build an obsession that leads eventually to murder. Between theatrical performances in 1902 and 1903, Evelyn writes numerous letters from boarding house rooms and later from the more comfortable hotel suites that White's patronage makes possible. She responds to invitations, thanks patrons for gifts and dinners, smooths over misunderstandings with careful diplomatic language. None of these letters survive in complete collections. Privacy and discretion were valued, and much correspondence was deliberately destroyed. But their existence and occasional contents are documented in trial testimony, biographies, and later published memoirs, where her writing becomes evidence in legal proceedings and historical reconstruction. The language she employs in these letters is formal and careful, following patterns taught by etiquette manuals. "My dear Mr. Wah, I remain sincerely yours," phrases that maintain appropriate distance while expressing gratitude. To be considered respectable, a young woman must write as if she were someone's properly raised daughter, not as a chorus girl whose income depends on her appearance and whose social position remains ambiguous. White encourages this formality, understanding that reputations are fragile and that the wrong word in a letter might be used against her if circumstances change. At her dressing table before evening engagements, she struggles with long evening gloves, pulling kid leather tight over her hands and forearms, fastening the tiny buttons that run from wrist to elbow. Etiquette manuals present glove-wearing as effortless, a natural extension of feminine dress, but they ignore the practical difficulties. The tight fit required for elegance makes the gloves difficult to put on and uncomfortable to wear for extended periods, and the leather shows every wrinkle and stain. requiring constant care and frequent replacement that strains limited budgets. The gloves serve multiple purposes. They conceal the calluses that develop from hours of studio posing, from gripping ballet barres during dance practice, from the physical labor that remains part of her daily life, despite the glamorous exterior. They also hide the involuntary tremor in her hands when she opens yet another letter from Harry Kendall Thaw, whose pursuit has intensified from occasional flowers and notes into a relentless campaign of telegrams, expensive gifts, and proposed rescues from her current life. Thaw's letters, insistent, passionate, increasingly possessive, arrive with disturbing frequency. He positions himself as savior, offering to remove her from the theater, to provide financial security, to restore her to the respectability he believes White has stolen. His language combines romantic devotion with an undercurrent of violence, rage at White mixing with professions of love for Evelyn, the two emotions becoming dangerously entangled. The narrator reflects that each folded sheet of correspondence brings her closer to a man who has constructed an elaborate fantasy in which chivalry can be proven with a gun, in which murdering an architect might somehow restore innocence to a woman who never asked for rescue. The letters accumulate in her rooms, paper evidence of an obsession she does not fully understand how to deflect or escape, while she continues the careful work of writing polite responses that neither encourage nor completely reject his increasingly unstable attention. By June 1903, as trial records and biographical accounts later document, Evelyn and Harry Thaw have a conversation whose exact words are disputed, but whose general content is preserved in multiple sources. She tells him what happened in Stanford White's apartment, the assault that society would never name as such, and Thaw's response transforms their relationship. He has long harbored hatred for White, partly based on social slights from New York society, partly from rumors about White's treatment of young women, and Evelyn's account crystallizes this animosity into something more dangerous. He frames himself as avenger, urging her to leave the architect's orbit, promising a future in which he will, as he writes in one letter, live like a Benedictine monk for her. Seke, his devotion pure, and his intentions honorable. They begin traveling together in Europe, journeying through England, France, Germany, and Austria. Hotel registers from late 1903 and early 1904 now list E. Nesbit beside one of America's richest surnames, a pairing that suggests either marriage or scandal, depending on whether observers know the couple is not yet legally wed. Thaw showers her with furs, jewels, expensive clothing, the material evidence of his ability to provide the security she has never known. Yet even as he demonstrates generosity, his temperament reveals itself in increasingly disturbing ways. Contemporary accounts from fellow travelers, later testimony from hotel staff, and Evelyn's own careful descriptions in her memoirs document explosive rages, interrogations about her past with White, demands that she repeat her story again and again in precise detail, as if the exact phrasing might somehow change what happened or transfer blame more completely to the architect. During one incident in an Austrian castle, Thaw has rented for their use. He beats her with a whip, an assault she describes decades later with the restraint required of women discussing male violence. He was not himself, she writes, temporarily overcome by passion, rather than habitually cruel. This is refinement as camouflage, the European grand tour and expensive hotels serving as tablecloth drawn over obsession and abuse. In public, appearing at hotel dining rooms and opera houses, she wears gloves and maintains the composed expression that photographers made famous. In private, she finds herself explaining repeatedly what was done to her in White's apartment, as if precise narrative could somehow satisfy Thaw's need for detailed knowledge, as if telling the story enough times might eventually exhaust his interest in it, rather than feeding his rage. The education she receives during these travels is not the cultural refinement that wealthy young women acquire on European tours, though she does visit museums and attend performances, but rather a darker curriculum in male possession, in the way that rescue rhetoric can mask control, in the thin line between protection and imprisonment. The narrator observes that the next lesson in this education will take place not in a Parisian salon or Alpine resort, but in a Pittsburgh registrar's office, where signatures on paper will formalize an arrangement that is already functioning as a kind of captivity. On 4 April 1905, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Evelyn married Harry Kendall Thaw in a ceremony whose details are carefully managed by his family. For reasons that biographers continue to debate, whether at Thaw's preference, his mother's insistence, or some compromise between them, Evelyn wears not white, but a black traveling suit with brown trim, an outfit more appropriate for boarding a train than for a wedding. The choice is unusual enough that newspaper accounts remark on it, reading the dark clothing as either sophisticated European style or as visual acknowledgement of something irregular about the union. Thaw's mother, Mary Copley Thaw, a formidable woman who controls access to the family fortune, agrees to the marriage only after extracting specific conditions. Evelyn must abandon the theater entirely, cease working as an artist's model, and must never speak publicly about her relationship with Stanford White. Her past must be not merely forgotten, but actively suppressed, buried under the weight of Thaw family money and social position. Legal documents are drawn up specifying allowances and settlements, carefully structured to protect the Thaw fortune from scandal, while providing Evelyn with enough financial security to make the arrangement viable. Newspaper notices in Pittsburgh and New York papers treat the marriage as a peculiar modern fairy tale, a notorious beauty redeemed by marriage to a millionaire, a chorus girl elevated to respectability through the transformative power of wealth and wedlock. The coverage is neither entirely approving nor completely condemnatory, but rather fascinated by the social boundary being crossed, by the question of whether money can truly buy legitimacy, or whether Evelyn's origins will always mark her as not quite proper despite her new surname. Behind these clipped announcements lies dense paperwork, marriage settlements, trust arrangements, allowances carefully calculated and legally secured. The documents are designed to manage risk, to contain potential scandal, to ensure that Thaw family wealth remains protected, even as one member of the family has chosen an inappropriate bride. Evelyn, reading these papers or having them explained by lawyers, must understand that she is being incorporated into a financial structure as much as into a family, that her new position is hedged with restrictions and conditions. Pulling on new gloves as they board the train departing Pittsburgh for their European honeymoon, expensive kid leather replacing the cheaper gloves she wore as a working performer, Evelyn must understand that the wedding ceremony has changed her name and her legal status, but has not erased her history. The past has not been forgotten or forgiven. It has been wrapped like her hands in something smooth and white and constricting, hidden beneath a surface of propriety that requires constant maintenance. The narrator reflects that she has stepped formally now into the architecture of privilege, into the world of wealth and social position that she observed from the outside as a chorus girl. But she enters as ornament rather than as architect, as decoration rather than as participant in designing her own life, her role carefully delimited by the contracts signed and the expectations established as conditions of her acceptance into the family. In late 1905 and early 1906, passenger manifests from transatlantic steamship lines document Mr. and Mrs. Harry K. Thaw traveling repeatedly between New York, Cherbourg, and Southampton, occupying first-class cabins on vessels like the SS Kaiser Wilhelm II and the SS Philadelphia. Their accommodations are spacious and expensive. Their fellow passengers include titled Europeans and wealthy Americans. The international set for whom crossing the Atlantic is routine rather than adventure. Thaw insists on being seen with Evelyn on the promenade decks and in the first-class dining salons, treating their appearances as public announcements that he has claimed what Stanford White once possessed, that she now belongs to him rather than to the architect. Society gossip columns, which previously mentioned Evelyn in connection with her theatrical work and her status as an artist's model, now describe her with new language. She is Mrs. Harry K. Thaw, her identity subsumed into her husband's name and fortune. Where once she earned her gowns and jewels by posing for hours in studios, they are now charged to Pittsburgh bank accounts, purchased through Thaw family wealth, rather than through her own labor. Reporters describe her beauty with the adjective respectable now, suggesting that marriage has transformed not her appearance but its meaning, that the same face that was once available for public consumption is now properly contained within matrimony. Yet the marriage bed, as she later writes in memoirs published after Thaw's death, is not the refuge that wedding vows might suggest. His moods remain volatile and dangerous. He continues interrogating her about White, demanding that she recount details of their relationship, his questions mixing jealousy with a kind of obsessive fascination. His rants about beasts who harm innocent girls, his claims to be protecting female purity through vigilance and rage, transform the rhetoric of chivalry into something that feels increasingly like surveillance, like imprisonment disguised as devotion. In public, appearing at theaters and restaurants, she adjusts the pale gloves that mark her transformation from working girl to gentleman's wife, smoothing the kid leather over her hands in a gesture that has become automatic. The gloves are expensive now, replaced whenever they show wear, maintained in the condition that wealthy women's accessories must always reflect. But in private, she cannot adjust his mind, cannot smooth over the obsessions and rages that marriage has formalized rather than calmed. Thaw purchases theater tickets for 25th of June 1906, framing the outing as a treat, an opportunity to attend the reopening of the Madison Square Garden rooftop theater and see the premiere of a new musical, Mam'selle Champagne. He presents the plan as entertainment, a pleasant summer evening, but he also knows that Stanford White maintains a regular table at the rooftop theater and that the architect often attends premieres of shows in the venue he designed. Whether Thaw plans violence in advance or whether the decision crystallizes in the moment remains disputed, but the theater, tickets that seem like innocent leisure will become the occasion for murder, the architecture of privilege transforming into a crime scene. On the evening of 25th of June 1906, after dining at Café Martin on Fifth Avenue, an expensive French restaurant where they eat a leisurely meal, Thaw showed no obvious signs of agitation to waiters or other patrons. The Thaws walk the short distance to Madison Square Garden. The night is warm, summer heat radiating from pavement and buildings, the kind of evening when the rooftop theater offers relief through elevation and open air, electric fans stirring the atmosphere while the audience sits in wicker chairs, drinking and smoking, the informal setting encouraging a relaxed social mood. Approximately 1,000 people fill the roof garden theater, dressed in summer evening wear, the men in light suits, the women in pale dresses. The musical Mam'selle Champagne is light entertainment, not high art. The plot concerning romantic complications among champagne merchants, the songs designed for easy listening rather than dramatic impact. The audience drinks champagne and cocktails, laughs at familiar jokes, fans themselves against the heat. Despite the warm weather, Thaw keeps on his black overcoat throughout the performance, the garment concealing a revolver he has brought with him. Whether this is premeditation or simply his habitual carrying of a weapon, wealthy men often carry firearms for protection, becomes a disputed question in subsequent legal proceedings. At approximately 11 o'clock, as the chorus performs I Could Love a Million Girls, a song whose title and lyrics seem to reference exactly the kind of male behavior Thaw finds so outrageous, Stanford White arrives and takes his customary seat at a table near the stage, a reserved location that reflects his status as the building's architect and as a regular patron. Multiple eyewitnesses later testify to what happens next, their accounts varying in small details, but agreeing on essentials. Thaw stands, removes his coat, approaches White's table. He appears to hesitate briefly, perhaps reconsidering or perhaps ensuring his position, then suddenly fires 3 shots at close range, 2 striking White in the face, 1 hitting his shoulder. The architect dies instantly, falling forward onto the table, blood pooling on the white tablecloth. Contemporary accounts record various versions of Thaw's words immediately after the shooting. Some witnesses report him saying, "I did it because he ruined my wife." Others recall different phrasing. "He deserved it," or "he had it coming." The exact language matters for legal purposes. Whether the statement suggests premeditation or temporary insanity, whether it demonstrates clear thinking or delusional thinking. But all versions agree on the basic claim. The murder is justified by White's treatment of Evelyn, framed as righteous vengeance rather than crime. The audience initially believes the gunshots are part of the theatrical performance, sound effects coordinating with action on stage. Then someone screams, chairs overturn as people scramble away from the body. The orchestra falters and stops. Panic spreads through the crowd while Thaw stands calmly, holding the revolver, making no attempt to flee. Evelyn later writes that a complete numbness of mind and body took possession of me in that moment, that she moved like a person in a trance, her consciousness unable to process what has just occurred on the rooftop of the building where she once attended performances as White's companion, the theater now transformed into a crime scene. Between the murder on 25 June 1906 and the conclusion of legal proceedings in 1908, newspapers across America and Europe devoted countless column inches to what they label the trial of the century, a phrase that appears in headlines from the New York Times to provincial papers in California and Texas. The case contains everything that sells newspapers: wealth, beauty, sex, violence, prominent victims and defendants, scandalous testimony that would normally be unprintable, all somehow rendered acceptable to discuss because legal proceedings make the details part of public record. Courtroom sketches and photographs show Evelyn seated in the witness area, wearing tailored suits in dark colors, blacks, dark blues, grays, that suggest mourning and propriety rather than the lighter colors associated with chorus girls. Her hats are veiled, her gloves are always perfectly fitted and clean, her posture is erect but not stiff. She has been coached for countless hours in hotel suites by Thaw's lawyers and by his mother, prepared to testify in ways that will support the defense strategy while maintaining the appearance of innocent victim rather than calculating participant. The defense constructs an elaborate narrative around the concept of dementia americana, a form of temporary insanity supposedly unique to American men who discover that their wives or sweethearts have been sexually violated. The argument, while medically dubious, appeals to cultural ideas about honor, masculinity, and the protection of female purity. To sustain this narrative, Evelyn must describe White's assault in detail sufficient to justify murder while maintaining the demeanor of respectable womanhood, must be simultaneously victim of sexual violence, an embodiment of innocence worth killing for. Her testimony, delivered over multiple days, is reported extensively in newspapers that normally would not print such explicit material. She describes the red velvet swing, the drugged champagne, waking to find that White had taken advantage of her, the euphemistic language required by courtroom decorum but clear enough in meaning. Press accounts linger on the harrowing circumstances, her girlish figure in black, the tears she struggles to contain, treating her testimony as theatrical performance as much as legal evidence, reproducing excerpts as if they were dramatic dialogue. The first trial ends in a hung jury, unable to agree on whether Thaw was insane at the moment of shooting or simply angry and vengeful. The second trial, with a different jury, finds him not guilty by reason of insanity, a verdict that sends him to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane rather than to prison. The outcome confirms what the entire proceeding has demonstrated, that the architecture of privilege can bend law as well as social custom, that sufficient wealth can reframe murder as temporary madness, that Evelyn's body and her history can serve as evidence in someone else's trial rather than as grounds for her own justice. The narrator observes that the trials make Evelyn globally famous. Her image appears in newspapers from London to San Francisco. Her story is discussed in parlors and barbershops. Her name becomes shorthand for scandalized innocence. But the same proceedings that make her famous leave her financially stranded and socially ambiguous, no longer quite respectable despite the jury's implicit acceptance of her victimization, still marked by scandal, even as she is portrayed as a wronged woman. After the second trial concludes in 1908 with Thaw committed to Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in Beacon, New York, Evelyn faces a new and unexpected crisis: financial abandonment. The Thaw family, having secured the legal outcome they desired, Harry confined rather than executed, the family name protected by medical diagnosis rather than criminal conviction, reduces and then eliminates the financial support they had provided during the trials. Evelyn, still legally married to Harry but effectively separated, must support herself once again. She returns to the stage, accepting vaudeville bookings that advertise her with blunt commercial honesty. Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, the girl in the red velvet swing, reducing her entire complicated history to a single sensational image, the prop from White's apartment becoming her professional brand. Audiences attend not to evaluate her theatrical talent, but to see the woman from the newspapers, to observe in person the beauty that caused such scandal, to consume the spectacle of her diminished circumstances. The work is demeaning but necessary. She performs in regional theaters and second-tier vaudeville houses, traveling the circuit of American cities where her notoriety still draws crowds, but where the venues are progressively less glamorous than the casino theater where she once danced in the Florodora chorus. She visits Thaw occasionally at Matawan, performing the role of dutiful wife for asylum administrators and for reporters who continue following the story. But the visits become less frequent as she rebuilds a life separate from him. In October 1910 in Berlin, Germany, she gave birth to a son whom she named Russell William Thaw. Her own accounts, recorded in later memoirs and interviews, insist that Harry is the child's father, conceived during a conjugal visit to Matawan. Harry Thaw denies paternity for the rest of his life, refuses to provide financial support, and eventually succeeds in having his marriage to Evelyn annulled. The question of Russell's paternity becomes another disputed element in her history, another piece of her private life transformed into public speculation. Years later, Russell appears as a child actor beside his mother in silent films including Threads of Destiny, 1914, and other productions. The credits acknowledging their relationship, while the films themselves capitalize on her continuing notoriety. She attempts to build a career in early cinema, where beauty and scandal both have commercial value, but the work is sporadic and poorly paid. The motion picture industry, still developing its star system, and uncertain how to market a woman whose fame derives from tragedy rather than talent. During this period, on stage tours and personal appearances, she continues wearing gloves when greeting patrons after performances, maintaining the gesture of respectability even as she sells autographed photographs and publicity stills to supplement her income. The gloves that once signaled her borrowed entry into privilege now mark a more desperate kind of self-respect, the determination to maintain dignity despite reduced circumstances, to perform propriety even when the performance is transparent to everyone watching. The narrator reflects that the world that once promised rescue through marriage, the fairy tale transformation from chorus girl to wealthy wife that gossip columns presented as both thrilling and cautionary, has offered instead asylum walls and vaudeville bookings, financial insecurity, and ongoing scandal. Evelyn begins reclaiming her story in the only way available to her, by telling it herself, by writing memoirs that will present her version of events rather than accepting the narratives constructed by lawyers, journalists, and the men who have claimed authority over her life. By 1914, as her memoir, The Story of My Life, appears in print and in newspaper serialization, Evelyn is performing in both silent films and stage productions that continue trading on her notoriety while she attempts simultaneously to capitalize on and escape it. The memoir offers her an opportunity to present her own version of events, to correct misrepresentations from the trials, to claim authorship of a story that has been told countless times by others. Reviews are mixed. Some critics praise her candor, others dismiss the book as sensationalism. Most acknowledge that her version of events differs significantly from trial testimony, shaped by years of distance and by her desire to control how history remembers her. The decades that follow trace a path of progressive diminishment punctuated by occasional returns to public attention. She performs in nightclubs during the 1920s, attempts comebacks in Atlantic City and other entertainment venues, teaches dance, makes ceramics, takes various jobs that use her beauty and her name recognition while offering little long-term security. The girl who once was called the most photographed woman in America becomes a middle-aged woman whose past fame provides neither income nor refuge. During World War II, living in Los Angeles, she taught ceramics, a quiet occupation that local newspapers note with mild interest. Evelyn Nesbit, once at center of sensational trial, now works with clay in a studio near downtown. The tone is not quite pitying, but certainly emphasizes distance, the transformation from scandal to obscurity, the young beauty who caused men to commit murder, now an elderly woman in a work smock. Her hands, once photographed endlessly, once insured by theatrical producers, once gloved in expensive kid leather, now stained with clay and glazes. In 1955, she served as technical consultant for the film The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, a Hollywood production starring Joan Collins that recreates the events of 1901-1906 with significant dramatic license. On set, watching a young actress swing on a velvet prop while cameras roll and directors call out instructions, Evelyn reportedly murmurs that the past has become somebody else's property, no longer hers to control or correct. The comment, whether precisely accurate or paraphrased by observers, captures the larger truth of her life. Her image and story have circulated for decades entirely separate from her actual existence, interpreted and reinterpreted by audiences who know the scandal, but not the woman. She dies on 17th of January 1967 in Los Angeles at age 82, having outlived both white and thaw, having survived poverty, scandal, single motherhood, the collapse of vaudeville, and the rise of Hollywood, the transformation of American social mores from Edwardian restriction to post-war liberation. Obituaries in major newspapers revisit the crime of the century, summarize the trials, note her various career attempts, but struggle to define what her life meant beyond the scandal, what she achieved beyond survival. Today, her photographs from 1901-1902, the Otto Cerrone A Bud images, the Gertrude Casimir portraits, the Portrait Miss N, held by the National Gallery of Canada, sit in museum collections and digital archives, available for viewing by researchers and curious observers. In many images, her hands are bare, revealing the fine bone structure that artists loved. But viewers familiar with Edwardian etiquette know that she would never have walked into a theater or restaurant without gloves, that the bare hands in photographs represent studio artifice rather than social reality. The camera returns to a single studio portrait from 1901, Evelyn seated in three-quarter profile, wearing a simple white dress with flowers at her breast, her dark hair loose and tumbling past her shoulders, her eyes lifted to gaze just beyond the camera lens at something the viewer cannot see. The photograph's formal composition suggests classical painting. The arrangement recalls Renaissance portraits. The lighting is soft and diffused. The overall effect is timeless beauty rather than temporal specificity. The card mount bears minimal text, the photographer's studio logo embossed in gold at the bottom, and on the reverse a penciled notation in handwriting not identified but presumably added by an archivist, Evelyn Nesbit, c. 1901. The photograph now resides in an archival storage box, handled only by curators wearing white cotton gloves, the same type of gloves that Evelyn once wore for very different purposes, hers to signal respectability and to conceal the evidence of her working life, theirs to protect fragile materials from the oils and acids in human skin. Outside the photograph's frame, the world it documents has vanished almost completely. Madison Square Garden was demolished in 1925, replaced by other buildings, and eventually by a new garden in an entirely different location. The rooftop theater where Stanford White died no longer exists except in photographs and architectural drawings. The Thaw fortune has been dispersed through multiple generations. The customs of Edwardian etiquette, the absolute requirement that women wear gloves in public, the elaborate rules governing correspondence and social calls, the rigid separation between respectable women and those who worked in entertainment have been abandoned, replaced by social codes that Evelyn would barely recognize. Inside the photograph's fixed frame, nothing has changed. A girl of 16 or 17 holds perfectly still, performing composure for an audience she will never meet, embodying beauty according to standards she did not set, serving as decoration in an architecture designed by others. Her posture is relaxed but controlled, suggesting ease while actually demonstrating the discipline of someone who has learned to sit motionless for hours to become the image that artists require. The first time she adjusted her gloves on a summer evening in June 1906, preparing to attend a premiere at the Rooftop Theater, she did not know what was coming, did not know that within hours a man would die in front of her, that her life would be dissected in courtrooms and newspapers, that her face and story would circulate through American culture for decades, interpreted and reinterpreted by audiences who knew the scandal but never knew her. She adjusted those gloves as protection, as armor, as a signal that she belonged or was trying to belong in spaces that had not originally been designed to accommodate girls from Pittsburgh boarding houses. Now the image is permanently fixed, a portrait of Grace captured in silver gelatin and preserved in archival conditions. The chemical processes that created the photograph stabilized so that future generations can continue viewing her exactly as she appeared in that moment. But what the photograph cannot capture or preserve is everything that Grace cost. The poverty that made beauty a commodity, the assaults that were never named as such, the marriage that promised rescue but delivered surveillance, the decades of performing her own scandal in vaudeville houses and nightclubs, the slow diminishment from beauty to notoriety to elderly obscurity. The photograph is beautiful, and the young woman in it is beautiful, and the viewer standing before it in a museum or scrolling past it on a screen sees beauty. What remains invisible, carefully cropped from the frame, is the architecture that produced that beauty, the economics, the violence, the constraints, all the costs that never made it into the caption.